welcome you all to, this is our final UW-Eau Claire Faculty Staff Forum of the semester. Of course, we'll be back in the spring. But welcome, and welcome to our friends online as well. You're in for a treat today, as you all know. And that this talk is also part of International Education Week. So we're delighted to be part of that programming. I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Sean McAleer is professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. He is the author of 2 books, Plato's Republic, an Introduction, and Confucian and Stoic Perspectives on Forgiveness, which you see on the screen behind me, and also numerous other articles and chapters. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sean and his talk on Confucian and Stoic Perspectives on Forgiveness. But before I turn things over to him, just a couple more things. We'll have some time after the talk for questions. And for our online viewers, I want to encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A function on your screen, either at the top or the bottom of the screen. And our wonderful graduate assistant, Matt, will read those aloud. And also, Dr. McAleer, when we have questions from the audience, if you could please repeat those for the benefit of our online viewers, and please don't make us remind you to do that.
Okay.
Thank you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McAleer.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. I was over the weekend and many other hours trying to put this together. This book came out, I think, last fall, and I have not looked at or thought about it since then. So it was nice to revisit some things. I'll give a little bit of background. This sort of has the fruit of a long time ago. I did an NEH summer seminar, philosophy camp, as Erica called it, at Western University, on Confucianism and virtue ethics. And virtue ethics is what I do in philosophy, moral philosophy. Kind of look at moral theory in terms of like character traits, and virtues are the basic stuff. And you explain like right action, say in terms of virtues, as opposed to saying, oh, duties are prior or producing the best outcome. So it's a sort of typically an Aristotelian inspired approach that kind of got revived in the late 1950s. I went to a pretty good grad school, and no one taught any Asian philosophy. And I think if I'd asked, I wouldn't have known to ask, could I do something in Confucianism? They maybe would have said, why would you want to do that? And they maybe would have sent me to the religion department. There's a lot of gatekeeping in philosophy. And I'm happy that I think that's changing a lot. Comparative philosophy, this is work in comparative philosophy. And that could mean like within a philosophical tradition, like I did my dissertation on Kant and Aristotle on virtue, 2 titans if there's a Mount Rushmore of Western philosophy, those 2 guys are on it. But this project is really across philosophical traditions, maybe that are culturally distinct and developmentally isolated. There was no contact between Stoics and Confucians. And so these traditions really developed on their own. And one value I've been finding that this NEH Institute brought out was there's certain things, in an article I wrote a while back, there's a problem in virtue ethics that Mengzi, one of the philosophers I'll talk about, he had sort of a solution to it. And so looking outside the tradition I was schooled in, where people have different starting assumptions and different sort of thoughts about what a philosophical question is, it's really valuable. And it's really been, it's been a great thing for me. I will say this, so contemporary philosophy of forgiveness in the mid-1970s kind of got kickstarted. People have been doing some work, but there was a particular philosopher wrote an influential piece. But it really goes back, and in his piece, Geoffrey Murphy, he really talks about Joseph Butler, who was an 18th century Anglican minister, who was also quite a good philosopher. And he had a couple of sermons on resentment and forgiveness that are really influential. People look quite a bit to even these days. So he sort of defined forgiveness as forswearing resentment, or he actually said revenge, felt in response to having been wronged by someone. So someone mistreats you and you have a sort of a moral anger at them, and it's sort of giving that up for some reasons. And a crucial distinction for Butler was the distinction between moral harm and neutral harm. He talked about natural versus moral evil. If we're both in line at Einstein's, and I'm really craving an everything bagel, and I get up there and Roxanne has gotten that last bagel. I'm like, ah, dang it, I'm disappointed. That's just, I didn't get something I wanted. That's like a neutral harm. If Roxanne, which she would never do, cut the line or grab the bagel out of my hand, like, wait a minute, I didn't get my bagel because you cheated somehow. I had a right to my place in line and you violated that right. So that's kind of like a moral harm versus just a neutral harm. I mean, life's full of neutral, we don't get our way, things don't go our way, right? But he thought it's really when it's a reaction to really being mistreated in some sort of moral sense. So that's really what he was especially interested in. And he's interesting because he thought that benevolence, goodwill towards people, and resentment were compatible with each other. And he says, so resentment's not inconsistent with goodwill. It's only when it entirely destroys my ability to have goodwill towards someone. That's when it's a problem, and that's what I should be giving up. He thought to forgive someone, you could forgive someone on Butler's view. And this isn't actually kind of a widely held view these days, and still sort of have some residual anger towards them. Like, I might think I've forgiven someone, and then their name comes up, and I go, oh, what a jerk. And I get on with my life. I'm not like obsessing about it. I'm sure I'm more often the object of that thought than I'm having. But he thought these things can work together. And it's really when it's excessive resentment. That's what he thought revenge was, when you're just so seething with this kind of indignation. So mid-1970s, 1975, so Jeffrey Murphy picks up on this, and he says, he explicitly identifies himself with Butler. So forgiveness is the forswearing of resentment, where it's a negative feeling, anger or hatred directed toward another has done one a moral injury or harm. So picking up on that important distinction. And then he makes this other qualification. Ceasing to resent you will not constitute forgiveness unless it's done for a moral reason. If I just have forgotten about it or banged my head and like didn't remember that this thing even happened or something, that he doesn't think should count as forgiveness. I need to be doing it. And people tend to agree with him that there needs to be like a moral reason, like someone apologized to me, but they sort of disagree about what counts as moral. Like someone might say, hey, my psychological well-being is at stake. So that's a good enough, that's a decent reason to sort of forgive this person and move on. And people might disagree with that, but they tend to agree with this basic idea. So, and it's worth, so forgiving someone is not justifying what they did. It's not like saying all things considered, you didn't act wrongly, you did the right thing. It's not excusing them for what they did. Like you shouldn't have done that, but you were not really responsible. You just had surgery and you were hopped up on goofballs and you didn't know what you were saying or something like that. It's not condoning. It's not saying, yeah, what you did was wrong, but I'm just going to overlook it. I'm going to act as though it didn't happen. And it's not pardoning, which sort of requires structure to pardon someone, and it's not also showing mercy. These things are all like they're in the same family, I think, kind of cousins. But forgiving is this other. So here's where philosophers we get to feel like we're scientists because we use the area. So I'm going to say B and W, victim and wrongdoer. And philosophers, at least in my training, like to give necessary and sufficient conditions for concepts like when is forgiving. Another approach, and I'm very more and more sympathetic to this, would be sort of, let's think of what paradigmatically, prototypically forgiveness is. I think Wittgenstein, the great 20th century philosopher, kind of was leaning this way. And I'm thinking of, I don't know if there's anyone from psych in there, so not, I can maybe make a mistake. But Eleanor Roch was a psychologist in the 70s. She started giving prototype theory of concepts. So like our concept of a bird, if you're trying to teach someone what a bird is, the concept of bird, you'd probably, if you gave an example, probably pick like a cardinal, maybe an eagle. You gave an example of someone says, what's a bird? Oh, a penguin. Penguins are birds. It's true that they're birds, but we think of birds as things that fly, and you'd be leaving something out. So something can still not fly but count as a bird. And that's an advantage to this approach. That the approach I'll do just for the sake of it, that's what I'm just doing. If one of these conditions isn't met, you're not forgiven. It's really defective since you have the exclusion of forgiving versus, you've forgiven with an asterisk, it's missing something. So it's just, it can go really either way. I just thought for the sake of the kind of argument, somebody can stick with the old philosophical formulation. So basically, the victim overcomes their resentment, it can been wrongfully treated, wrongfully harmed, and does it for a moral reason. That's essentially that Murphy. The nice thing about this is you can have a lot of variation. This sort of structures a lot of the philosophical literature on forgiveness. Third party forgiveness. Instead of the victim forgiving, what if it's some third party? So a third party overcomes their resentment, resignation of what the wrongdoer did to someone else, and the third party does it for a moral reason. So you might finally come to forgive the person who harmed your best friend or your child. Would be this idea. Constraints on the connection between and the victim. If I say, I've forgiven Johnny Depp for things he did to Amber Heard. Say, A, well, Sean, why do you even know who those people are? But B, well, what's your connection? Like that would be an odd thing to say. I've forgiven Hitler. That would just be an odd thing for me to say. I can imagine someone with family who died in the Holocaust. That would make more sense coming from them. So that's the kind of thing someone might, try to work out. Self-forgiveness. I think this is super popular in like psychological literature and in pop psychological literature, especially. And here, the thing is the victim and the wrongdoer, they're one and the same person, right? So the victim forgives themselves for some wrongful harm they did themselves, and they do it for a moral reason. Now, this is problematic because it's hard to see how you can wrong yourself. I can harm myself. If I like smoke and eat terrible food and don't get exercise, I'm harming myself physically. But if I'm doing these things voluntarily, it's hard to see how that can be a wrong. I can violate a right I have against myself. There's no Latin maxim, and usually if it's in Latin, it's true. So valenti non fit injuria. You can't be wrong, the sense of the injury in that legal sense, that jur morpheum, like jury jurisprudence. You can't be wrong by what you consent to. So this is something people who defend self-forgiveness have to sort of give an account of, okay, why condition 2 shouldn't matter here, or how you can wrong yourself. But this basic format of these 3 conditions, a lot of variations we can have. So and one last thing to sort of background, and this comes from Murphy. So he thought of wrongs as sort of messages. When you wrong someone, you're sending them a message that my interests count more than your interests. Your rights are not anything I have to consider when I'm deciding what to do. It's kind of demeaning message that you're sending. And one thing that's interesting about this is it makes sense of why apologies give you good reason to forgive someone. If someone sincerely apologizes, right? Which isn't well, if your feelings were hurt, I guess I'm sorry. Like that's not, however, typically is not really an apology. So I'm saying, what I did to you was wrong. I never should have treated you that way. You're entitled to better treatment. I'm really sorry I did that to you. Where I'm negating the message. If the message I sent by treating someone a certain way was, you don't matter, and I say, you do matter. I was wrong to act like you did. That sort of makes sense of apology. And also, someone who's too ready to forgive, the worry is maybe they're agreeing with the demeaning message. And especially resentment is seen to protect self-respect. That if you have self-respect and someone treats you as though you're someone who's not worthy of respecting, resentment is a way to sort of protest that, right? So this sort of can shape a lot of discussion of forgiveness. So on now to classical Greek and Chinese thought. So here's the thing, there is no forgiveness in classical Chinese thought and in Greek thought. There's things kind of like it, but it's not there. And here's a couple of like eminent figures. And in my experience, you sometimes find terms translated as forgiveness that really just means sort of, like empathetic understanding, and that are sort of don't match that sort of 3-part analysis that contemporary philosophers would give of forgiveness. So my project then, on the assumption these fellows are right, is what explains the absence of forgiveness in classical Chinese thought and Greek thought, especially in the Confucian tradition and in Stoicism, especially as it's embodied in Rome in the first couple of centuries the Common Era, and especially a philosophical explanation, right? Given the conceptual economies, so to speak, of Confucianism and Stoicism, why is it that they don't make any room for forgiveness and maybe can't make any room for forgiveness? And there are other kinds of explanations. You give like historical explanations and cultural explanations and dialectical materialist explanations and all sorts of stuff. The one I'm sort of competent, I hope, to give is a philosophical account of what is it about the way the concepts that make these sort of schools of thought, the schools of thought they are. Why do they rule that out? And then second, what alternatives, if any, to forgiveness do they have to offer? And I think that they both have really things that are certainly different from forgiveness and maybe better in certain ways. So at least they're not bereft of any way to deal with the anger one might feel at being mistreated. So here's classical Confucianism. Kongzi, Mengzi, and Shunzi, and a lot of us know them by their Latinized names when Jesuits went over to China in like the late 16th and early 17th century. Confucius, great master Kong, that was, Confucius, right? Mengzi, a disciple of his a little bit later. Shunzi doesn't have a Latinized name, but he's the only one of the three we have a quote from on our wall. So that's got to come for something. I'm going to focus on Mengzi, Mencius, because he's the clearest of excluding forgiveness. The other two who are flanking him, they don't talk about it, but there's nothing like that prevents them from talking about it. But with Mengzi, it's really like an impossibility. So, and it really comes from a view he has about self-examination, the fruits of self-examination. And this is a common thing. You know, Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. Examining ourselves is not something unique to these traditions. But like in the Analects of Confucius, an early passage, every day I examine myself on 3 points. When I work to benefit someone, did I do my best? In my relationship with friends, did I fail to be trustworthy? Did I pass on knowledge I myself had not put into practice? Was I preaching what I wasn't practicing? Confucius, the master, says, when you meet a worthy person, think how you could become his equal, which requires some self-awareness, right? When you meet an unworthy person, turn inward and examine your own conduct and see, am I at that same level? So this sort of self-examination is common trope in Confucianism. And it begins, Mengzi starts the same way. So if one loves others and they're not affectionate towards himself, one should examine one's own benevolence, which is the core virtue of the Confucian tradition. And it's interesting because the character there, it's the character on the left is the character for person and the number 2. So for them, ethics is really interactive. It's really about how we are in community with other people, which is kind of interesting. So, and if one rules over others and they're unruly, one should examine one's own wisdom. If one treats others with propriety, another key virtue, especially for Confucius, was ritual propriety, and they do not respond, one should examine one's own reverence. If in one's actions one does not succeed, one should always seek for it in oneself. So I think there are times, and this is horrible advice, no person in an abusive relationship should be thinking, oh, I wonder what I did to bring on this beating. No. But I think in many other circumstances, this looking, what have I done? What's my part in this? Is really the core of the Confucian tradition, that looking within to see, what, if anything, have I done to bring this about? So here's where forgiveness begins to, where his inward turn really gets distinctive. So says, here's a person who's harsh to me. Someone's mistreating me. A junzi, a morally exemplary person, will invariably examine himself, saying, I must not be benevolent. I must be lacking in ritual propriety. How else could this situation have come upon me? Why would this person be mistreating me if I didn't mistreat them in some way? What am I doing to have brought this on? Not in a self-pitying, what did I do to deserve this? But like, what's my role in this? So if he examines himself and is benevolent and has propriety, yet the other person is still harsh, still mistreating them, a junzi will invariably examine himself saying, well, I must not be devoted. Let me drill down deeper. I must not be loyal to my principles and being true to the various roles I'm inhabiting. So we take another self-examination. And then he says, if he examines himself and is devoted, yet the other person is still harsh, a junzi says, this person is simply lost. What difference is there between a person like this and an animal? What point is there in rebuking an animal? So what's happening here philosophically is he's really denying the agency of the wrongdoer. They've fallen below like personhood, kind of entities that we have relationships with, where we sort of feel, gratitude or maybe resentment. How other people regard us matters to us. This wrongdoer, if there's no reason I've given them to treat me this way, they're just somehow like, I don't want to say they're not subhuman, but they're missing something fundamental about being a person. So here's the deal. They lack agency just like animals do. I mean, think about the way, if your dog comes in and, poops in the living room, you don't like it and you clean it up and you may be bad dog, but imagine like, your next door neighbor comes over. You would react very, very differently, right? There's something, what the heck? Like you say, you might say, dog, better. And you kind of mean you've been trained, but you would be floored if someone else did this, right? Because we think of, we're the kind of creatures that can deliberate and decide and act on moral reasons, right? Psychopaths can't act on moral reasons. They can fake it, right? And he's not saying that a lot of us are psychopaths, but just that we're somehow falling below that capacity we have to sort of interact on that human level. So they're really not wrongdoers, right? And the way your dog can't do a wrong, right? We love our dogs, but they're not the kind of creatures that deliberate about what goodness and badness is. Well, he says I'm a good boy, but what is goodness? I mean, they don't, right? They don't do that kind of thing. We can do that kind of thing. So if there's no agency, there's no wrongdoer. And if there's no wrongdoer, well, there's no wrong done. And if there's no wrong done, well, then there's nothing to forgive. You might excuse them, but then they forgive them for. If there's nothing to forgive, well, forgiveness is impossible, or at least it's incoherent. Or on that sort of paradigm model, if you said I forgive you, there's an important part you're really missing. It's sort of really incomplete forgiveness, right? So this is where this monks in this self-examination and the conclusion of the self-examination that they're lost. And he's really concerned in his work with that line between the human and the non-human animal. Like that we're somehow, our nature is good. We have these seeds of goodness within us that need to be cultivated. And so for him, this really calls for an explanation that someone's mistreating you. So that's with monks. Now here's something from the law that I think helps organize this thought. So like criminal liability. It's not enough that you've done something bad. My dissertation advisor once asked, why is it that when philosophers give examples, it's always killing someone? And I could cause a death, right? I could do it intentionally. I did it on purpose. I could do it knowingly. I knew it was going to happen. I didn't do it because I didn't want them to have it. I was, going to let it happen. I was reckless. I disregarded a risk my conduct posed. I was aware of it and didn't care. Or I was negligent. Like, I didn't know. I never thought the gun was loaded. Well, you should have looked if the gun was loaded, right? So these ways of being at fault are ways of, this is the sort of thing, monks seems to be saying, you just don't, this person who's wrong you, they're just sort of a beast. This isn't the kind of thing that we think we hold, a standard we hold them to, because they're not capable of it. So the idea is like merely causing harm. It's got to be that moral harm that only a moral agent can do, right? According to the Butler model. So Monk says there's no mens rea, there's just no forgiveness. That's the Mengzi. That's why he's really saying it's impossible, it's incoherent. Confucius and Xunzi Xunzi actually comes super close to having a little passage where one person intentionally overcomes their ill will, but it's really for self-interested reasons. So he comes actually pretty close to having a forgiveness. Confucius, it just doesn't come up. It's just not something he ever really talks about, how to respond when you've been mistreated. The only thing he'll say is, well, don't get angry about it. But for Mengzi, it's really, forgiveness is just off the table. Okay, now here's Roman Stoicism. As I was walking over here on this beautiful day, wondering who's going to come on such a beautiful day, I was trying to add up the ages of all the dead guys I'm talking about. And it's like 18,000 years. So at any rate, Seneca, he was Nero's tutor, really sort of eminent Roman. He's the only one who wrote in Latin. The rest, Musonius Rufus, probably people haven't heard of. He was Epictetus's teacher. And he's sort of Marcus Aurelius's philosophical grandfather, because Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, the person he quotes the most, I think maybe other than Plato or Socrates is Epictetus. I'm going to really be mostly a Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. Here's something that my groundbreaking research discovered, that Marcus Aurelius was in Fleetwood Mac. No other scholar has come to this conclusion. So if this doesn't make my name, I don't know what's going to. All right. So here's the thumbnail, the basics of Epictetus. Here's the fundamental distinction for him. What's in my power? What isn't? What can I directly control? And what can't I directly control? What I can't control, the weather. And this came up from, we're doing this in my intro class. These are some of the things I come up with. The Packers. For me, students doing the reading or not, I can encourage it. I can't control it. Your reaction to this talk, I can't control how you're going to react. Here's one that Epictetus say, my body, right? As I'm aging, my body's doing things like I don't approve of, but I can't make it not do that. My possessions, my friend's success, being killed or exiled, these are concerns of Epictetus's, given the culture at Rome. This is sort of always an option. So these things, some of them are outcomes of my actions and other people's actions. I can't control outcomes. And I won't say this with certain people in the room, but this makes me doubt the wisdom of outcomes-based assessment as a card-carrying Stoic. Just kidding. What is in my control are the choices I make, the judgments I make, right? And there's this great line in the Enchiridion, the handbook, the sort of Epictetus's greatest hits. It's not the things themselves that disturb people, but their judgments about the things. It's not that, that the weather's bad. It's just that I judge this is enough to ruin my effort. Or today's like, oh my gosh, what an amazing day. Or the Packers losing. I may give that meaning and let that be something that detracts from my happiness because I'm upset that my team's not winning or something. So what's within my power of choice, all these things, and this is the Greek, it's prohairesis. It's this kind of thing that adult persons typically have. We can deliberate and decide about things. And it's this little spark of Zeus in us, what's external to my power of choice. These are the things I can't control. And cause these externals. And here's what the real payoff here is: only my choices are good, or that's where good and bad live. Virtues and vices, good choices and judgments, bad choices. Everything that's external, it's indifferent. It's neither good nor bad. Some of these indifference we prefer. I would prefer the pack. I'll make a confession. When I'm watching my White Sox be terrible lately, I'll say, okay, though I prefer a White Sox victory to a White Sox loss, neither can make any difference to my well-being. I'll remind myself of this, and I won't be like, yeah, right? Some things we just prefer. Stoics have this weird view that virtue, that's all you need to be happy. All you need is stuff you can take care of. Now, it's no accident. Imagine what a Stoic Valentine's Day card would look like. Honey, your well-being isn't indifferent. Can make no difference to my well-being. But of all the indifference, it's my most strongly preferred indifferent. Right? No Stoics ever get hired at Hallmark. But this picture, kind of stark picture of value, is sort of at the heart, and we'll see in a second about why Stoics, there's no room for forgiveness. And briefly, the account of emotion, Aristotle, who they look to in many ways, thought emotions are complex things. There's a phenomenological component, how it feels. There's a teleological, so goal-directed, motivational component. And there's a cognitive component. Emotions are not just raw feelings. They're structured in this way. Anger, he said, it's a painful desire for revenge. It's some unjustified slight. And that's maybe what I'm supposed to be overcoming when I forgive. And I've tried to keep the colors sort of to match up with the elements. Stoics really double down on this. They think emotions are just judgments. Anger in response to ill treatment is doubly irrational because it wrongly judges the event, you're stealing my iPad, is bad, but it's not bad. It's an external, so it's indifferent. I wish you hadn't done that, but I am not harmed by your doing that because what you do is not in my control. Also, when I seek revenge, I wrongly judge it would be good if you suffered. Well, that's not true because whether you suffer or not, that's not something I can control. So that's neither good nor bad, right? So this hopefully makes some sense. Here's a famous quote from Socrates at his trial, where he ends up being put to death or having to drink hemlock. He says, my two accusers, they can kill me, but they can't harm me. So he's not himself a Stoic, he predates it, but he's like the inspiration of Stoicism. So if to harm someone is to make them worse off, and to benefit someone is to make them better off, well, no one else can harm or benefit me, because all the stuff they can do, oh, that's on that I can't control side of the line. That's indifferent. It's neither good nor bad. I would prefer you not to do that. But whether you do that or not, it can't harm me. And since forgiveness requires that the wrongdoer actually wrongfully harm the victim, and nobody can do that to you, well, then there's never anything to forgive, right? So two different, where Munga seems to sort of deny the agency of the wrongdoer. So look, there's no mens rea state there. There's no responsible agency. So there's nothing to forgive. The Stoics seem to say, well, no, there's no actus reus. There's no bad act. No one can make me worse off. Only I can do that by making bad choices and judgments. So that's the, so in both cases, there's nothing to forgive. They kind of get there through different roads, given their philosophical commitments. All right, I'll try to be quick here in the interest of time. One thing Stoics do is find reasons to excuse people. Hey, all wrongdoing is involuntary. People are ignorant about what's good and bad, so that's why they do the stuff that they do. They're kind of determinists of a sort, so that no one could have really done otherwise, given the kind of creature that they are. I'll just zip through these. This one, the partners in karma project, well, we're no better. You know, I'll pause at this one. So when you're shocked at another's wrongdoing, pass on at once to consider what similar faults you are committing on your own account. If you turn your mind to this, you will soon forget your anger. So instead of like thinking about forgiving, taking this other attitude towards them and sort of looking at myself, I'm just as bad. I've done that kind of thing, right? I won't read this long one from Seneca, but the end of this is just so fantastic. There's one thing we can give that can give us peace: agreeing to cut each other some slack. Stop insisting. I go through life still surprised that people don't use their turn signals. Still surprised people tear through the Hibbard lot, and don't put their shopping carts away and stuff like that. And I instead could say, you know what? I should know better by now, right? So there's some options. One thing Stoics do is, this is my favorite quote from Marcus Aurelius that in the interest of time I won't quote, but like, prepare yourself for the day. Today we're meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. Not because the world's full of jerks. All of them due to the offender's ignorance of what is good and evil. They don't know better. Right? And I think that, but I know the difference between good and evil. And the nature of the culprit, who's my brother, not in the physical sense, but as a fellow creature endowed with reason. So taking this picture of, we're all in this together. I should care for these folks and stop being so angry with them all the time. So that's preparing yourself. You might do this already. Oh my God. Like my department, our meetings are great. We all really get along, but it wasn't always the case. And I can imagine being like, oh God, there's a department meeting today. Oh no, he's on the agenda. Oh, and preparing ourselves for like, this probably I shouldn't be surprised if this happens. And I'm probably less worked up if I'm not taken by surprise. So quickly, some alternatives to forgiveness. Stoicism works well in like the middle realm of parking lots and freeways. It doesn't work so well like with our near and dear, with the Valentine's Day card example. Great philosopher Claudia Card, she was at Madison for years, died a couple of years ago. She said, look, there's two ways of thinking about, moral duties. You want to think that way. One's like this bookkeeping model where I'm keeping track of my moral debits and credits. The other one that's appropriate to like this realm of dealing with strangers. But then she talked about the trustee or guardian model. I've been in our friendship. I've been entrusted with something really good and valuable. And I don't think I've got duties. I think I've got some responsibilities to nurture this thing. And I think one thing that I think both of these do is to think we should be more loving. We should maybe extend that sphere where that trustee caretaker model is more appropriate, where we're not, well, you wronged me, so you owe me. I'm a creditor, moral creditor to you. But start thinking about, well, what would make for a better department, a better campus community? Even Marcus Aurelius, we think of Stoics as like these emotionless folks, and they preach that to some extent. But love and sense of benevolence and caring about people is definitely on the table for them. This last thing, being more forgiving, not forgiving, but is a character trait, letting stuff kind of roll off my back in the same way that a cinder path is more forgiving on a runner's knees than a sidewalk is. There's more room for sort of margin of error, maybe less reason to have anger to overcome. And we get this sort of picture of an ideal person as someone who's, they're easygoing. They sort of don't get worked up at the various little slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that I often get worked up at. Gentleness is invincible, says Marcus Aurelius. I think that's awesome. And I love this quote from Epictetus. If you must be affected in this unnatural way at the ills of others, like you're feeling emotional, you should pity them rather than hating them. Give up this readiness to take offense and to give vent to hatred. And I actually have this in Greek over my desk at home. Give up this walking around, we just ready to be irked at stuff like that. So some options, even though both these schools of thought have sort of off the table that people will the process of forgiving someone, but they both have these other options that in some ways I think maybe nicely complement this sort of custom of the sort of act of forgiving. But in some ways I think that they're maybe a little bit superior because they're really getting at what I'm like, what virtues I'm cultivating as a person rather than the actions that I'm taking. Gosh, when I practiced this on my desk, it was like I was done in 22 minutes, and I did not do that here. So there's a couple more things, but I will just stop here and see if there's any questions or thoughts from anyone. So thanks. Fine. Thanks for coming.
Going back to an earlier point that you raised, I'm wondering if you can't extrapolate all of this into pointing who is at fault and who's given a rumors out. You might connect back to that and help in that discussion.
Indeed. Maybe there's an Urca grant in my future for that one.
It seems like an obvious way to go.
Yes. Well, maybe we could collaborate. I actually had this idea for a project in my mind: forgiveness in Mozart's operas, because there's a lot of situations. It'd be fun to work on. Just be great to listen to Mozart every day and blah blah blah. Any other? Yeah.
There's a question from online. It's in regard to your book.
Yeah.
So the person read you as skeptical about classical Greek Stoics and early Chinese on the normativity of forgiveness. Are they correct in that? And what's your own view on that?
Oh, yeah. So if the view is that there really isn't forgiveness, certainly in Stoicism, it's kind of out. I think in Mengzi's philosophy, the middle Confucian, yeah. I think both Kongzi, Confucius, and Xunzi both can make room for it. It's nothing like ruling it out for them. It's just not something, and it may be one explanation for why there's not forgiveness in Confucius, especially, is self-respect is not at all a player for him. Respecting others. I mean, for him, a virtuous person is going to be deferential, sort of accommodating, and not be someone who's regularly asserting their sort of moral boundary that you violated. So I think for sure Stoics, there just isn't a space for it, given their other commitments, that no one can wrong me. And I think with Mengzi, yeah, given what he seems to rule it out, but the other two Confucians, they could, they just don't, which also calls for explanation. Yeah.
It seems like the forgiveness idea feels very like transactional or almost like capitalist. We're owed something and then are repaid, or so I'm wondering if some of this is about the idea of like you can only focus on yourself, or you can only sort of like control you, versus the idea of like you are in sort of like a business arrangement of morality, right? So I'm just wondering if the forgiveness model is sort of like tied to the transactional.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, is like forgiveness as philosophers kind of understand it, like it seems transactional. And I think that's right. And I think one thing about the Confucian tradition is it's just a different world. It's not a world of discrete individuals who come together to form a community. It's much more naturally community focused. And they seem to have and this is classical Chinese thought generally, is sort of a relational conception of selves. Is sort of we're in all these various roles I inhabit and relationships I have, and I'm whatever role is relevant in the situation. So there isn't that sort of like bargaining. I mean, there's certainly bargaining in the marketplace, right, for Confucius, but it's definitely, he's got a really different picture of what selves are. I think all the classical Chinese philosophers do than the sort of modern. I mean, it's really with Kant that like self-respect and like the 18th century, that really starts to be a big thing. And it's definitely with the development, there's certainly, that would be an interesting economic account of that sort of the way thinking is, as our economies change, the way people conceive of themselves changes, and what we're doing in a non-economic exchange can still have that kind of economic. So it's super insightful. I think that's definitely part of the deal, part of the story.
Let's thank Dr. McAleer. If you have questions, you can certainly ask them.
Thank you so much for coming. Sorry I went over.